Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Lincoln Square. Very excited this morning to have voteriders here with us. We have both Lauren Kunis, who is the President and CEO, Executive Director of voteriders, and Jessica Hulett, who is the Houston Regional Director for voteriders. And because I didn't identify where you two are on the screen, oh good, we do have our bylines there. So sorry about that, folks. You guys are doing such important work and have been for years now. Lauren, can you give everybody a background on what voteriders is and the type of work that you do?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. And thank you, first and foremost, for having us on this morning. So voteriders is a national voting rights organization. We are focused on helping every eligible voter across the country get the ID they need to vote. As you mentioned, we've been at this for quite some time. voteriders was founded in 2012 by attorney Kathleen Unger. I think I can safely say that she could not have possibly imagined how the need for our work would grow so tremendously in the 2012 to present day period. So our programs span across the country, but we're also on the ground in 7 states right now. Our programs include voter education, making sure that every single voter knows exactly what they need, if anything, to bring to the polls to cast a ballot that counts. We provide free one-on-one assistance to any eligible voter who needs an ID to vote where they live. Sometimes this is as simple as making an appointment for them at the DMV. Other times it involves weeks or even months of one-on-one work, paying for underlying documents like a birth certificate, paying for transportation to and from ID issuing offices. Soup to nuts help to make sure that ID is not a barrier for anyone's right to vote. We do a lot of outreach in our own right when it comes to text banking and phone banking and writing letters. We work with thousands of partners across the country to really sort of multiply our reach and impact. And we do lots of comms and digital campaigns. Any opportunity we have to talk about the rising barriers to the ballot box due to ID, we are really excited to jump in on there. You know, raising awareness is a huge part of the battle in making sure that people in the United States today know what they need to vote in this shifting landscape of increasingly strict requirements.
And Jessica, you are one of those folks on the ground in Houston. Can you talk to us a little bit about what your day-to-day with voteriders is like?
Absolutely, yeah. So as you said, my name's Jessica and I'm the Houston Regional Director here at voteriders. So I'm based in Houston and I spend a lot of my time in the greater Houston area working with partner organizations that are doing anything from direct service work at shelters or pantries, community centers, places like that, places where you might find people that are most at need for identification assistance. I also spend my time at community events talking about voting and elections and voter ID and all of those very good fun things, policy, advocacy, all of that. I've been with voteriders since, I believe it was August of 2022. So I've had, a bit of time to have a few different, a lot of my time now isn't spent as much with the on the ground voters. I don't get the luxury of that anymore. I get to spend my time, another luxury, but spending time with our partner organizations and meeting with community leaders and the work that they're doing. But my colleague here in Houston, Zawani, gets to spend a lot of her time speaking with on-the-ground voters. And then I sometimes do.
Yeah, that must be nice to get back out into the field occasionally and have that direct contact with voters. Lauren, you had mentioned that your founder could not have imagined the need that there is right now. You run one of those organizations, sort of like we do, that we hope at some point it's obsolete to be talking about all of these, obstacles to voting and all the other anti-democracy efforts that are going on around the country and the world at this point. Can you describe some of what the obstacles are now that are in place to people having access to voting, and some of what you see like in the SAVE Act, in new hurdles that are being created?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great question. I think it's really important to think about the fact that voter ID laws are actually a relatively new phenomenon in the sort of landscape of voting restrictions in the United States. Right now, 38 states have voter ID laws in place. So when I say voter ID law, I mean after you register to vote and affirm your citizenship and residence and identity, then 38 states have additional requirements of a specific document that you need to bring in order to go to the polls and cast a regular ballot and make it count. More and more states also have ID requirements for voting by mail. Some require a photocopy of your ID as part of your mail-in ballot. All that to say, really since 2013 and the gutting of the Voting Rights Act with Shelby v. Holder, we have seen an explosion of voter ID laws across the country. Just in the period between 2020 and today, we have seen 18 states pass new or stricter ID laws. And there, unfortunately, are no signs of this trend slowing down. Our partners at the Voting Rights Lab have a great state tracker where they can track pending bills by issue across the country almost in real time. I pulled that up this morning. There are 160 bills in 40 different states on the issue of voter ID. So in some states, a really troubling trend we've seen is the striking of student ID as an accepted form of ID at the polls. Other states are adding new requirements for mail-in voting when it comes to specific IDs. Another disturbing trend we've seen in the ID to vote landscape, particularly since 2020, and even more particularly since the 2024 election, is requiring documentary proof of citizenship. So this is a pretty jargony term, which essentially means to register to vote successfully, you would need to show a hard copy of a vital document like a birth certificate or a passport at your local election office. There are 57 bills moving right now in 26 different states that would require documentary proof of citizenship. And I don't want to be alarmist because there is no way, thankfully, knock on wood, that anywhere close to all of those would pass. But we see that these bills are already causing enormous confusion, even if they go nowhere, even if they never make it out of committee in a certain state house. We run a voter ID helpline where eligible voters can call or text with questions at any time about ID. And we're seeing a huge spike in the number of people who are calling very confused about what they might need or not need to register and vote in response to media that they've seen around pending bills. I think I saw this flash up on the screen earlier, but just to sort of define the scope of the problem we are trying to solve for at VoteRiders, 34.5 million voting age American citizens, that's about 15% of eligible voters, don't have a state issued photo ID with their current name and address on it. That is a huge proportion writ large, but it's even higher when we look at young people and communities of color and students, for example. When we look at documentary proof of citizenship, our research found that 21.3 million Americans, or 9.1% of voting age citizens, don't have easy access to vital documents like a birth certificate or a passport. So this means either you don't have one at all, or if you needed to show it tomorrow, like if you needed to register to vote tomorrow and needed your birth certificate, almost 10% of people told us that they could not readily produce this. One of the bills we're watching most closely, of course, is the SAVE Act at the federal level. This recently passed in the House. It thankfully faces much steeper barriers in the US Senate, but we are not backing down at all in making sure that this terrible piece of legislation never becomes law. The SAVE Act would require a vital document to register and vote. It would upend the ability of groups like ours to help voters register and cast a ballot successfully. It would place enormous unfunded burden on local election offices across the country and cause tons of confusion. So we are by no means, feeling like our work here is done on the SAVE Act. There's a lot of advocacy to still do to make sure that it never becomes law. But another thing we're watching very closely is mini SAVE Acts, if you will, copycat legislation in the states that actually has a much greater pathway to passage than we see at the federal level. And one of those states is Texas. Texas is dangerously close to passing their own version of the SAVE Act, which would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote and place an enormous burden on eligible Texans across this huge state to be able to register and vote in a state where it's already really hard to vote, relatively speaking. I'll let Jessica dive into that part more, but just on the research side. So we do lots of research at the national and also increasingly state levels. We found that 1.3 million Texans would not have easy access to proof of citizenship if they needed it tomorrow to register to vote. So we are watching with a lot of concern, doing everything we can to mobilize our community to speak out in opposition to these dangerous bills.
So Jessica, I would love to have you speak some on the legislation that you're seeing in Texas. Also, that idea of confusion, we saw it happen in 2018, 2020, 2020. It just is a constant reducing of the number of ballot boxes, of drop boxes for early voting, or relocating where they are, or creating these new rules so that there's a constant fear that is being instilled in people that they're going to do something wrong that might get them in trouble, and it becomes easier to vote. So what are those sorts of things that you're seeing in the population in Texas that you're trying to work with?
Yeah, all of that is very, very true. I think it's important to start the conversation with acknowledging that Texas is already one of the hardest states to vote in the United States. They do not make it easy for us. And then bills like our version of the SAVE Act here in Texas, SB 16, also called HB 5337, again, they make nothing easy here, would just sort of make that even more difficult for Texas residents and citizens. So the proof of citizenship bill that we have here doesn't do anything to prevent the issues that it's trying to address, but it creates or increases the burden for already marginalized communities here in Texas and effectively further shuts them out of the democratic process, something that's supposed to be promised to all American citizens. So a lot of the people that we're working with on a daily basis here in Texas, especially in the Houston area, fall into some of the communities that are going to be most impacted by bills like SB 16, our documentary proof of citizenship bill. So, citizens that are recently naturalized, that may be wrongly flagged as non-citizens due to outdated DPS, our version of like the DMV data here, or married women who have changed their last names but lacked, updated identification documents. Also, young voters. We work a lot with young people here in the greater Houston area. A lot of young people have never had Texas driver's licenses or passports and may not have easy access to like their birth certificates. I know up until recently, it's kind of embarrassing, but I had to like call my mom to get my birth certificate from her so that I could have my passport appointment. And I'm 27, not a lot of people have these things just on hand with them all the time. Also, a big consideration for Texas voters, we're a massive state that has a lot of area between major cities. So rural voters in particular can be heavily impacted by bills like SB 16 because the burden that puts on them from getting from where they are to their nearest elections office to give proof of their citizenship can be quite outrageous and put sort of an undue extra burden on them. So beyond even just like the maybe lack of access to some of these documents that a lot of people are going to be experiencing and facing here in Texas. I believe it's 1.3 million that our research has shown Texans lack those documents. There's also sort of the chilling effect that comes along with bills like SB 16. You have people that are just even more confused than they used to be, which was already confusing, even more unlikely to participate and actually be able to engage in the democratic process because they're just worried that they're going to be shamed or turned away when they try to register or vote.
We haven't yet talked about cost as a barrier. Mm-hmm. Can you, I'll invite both of you to talk about this, but Lauren first, the barrier of getting these documents, not just logistically, but driver's licenses and passports and birth certificates. All of these have a cost connected to them. And on the logistical side, taking time off from work to be able to go and access the documents that you need. How do we see this really having an impact on particular communities?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's something we talk about a lot at VoteRiders. I think it's really important to have sort of a holistic view of what cost is. And to your point, exactly, Lisa, cost is not just the $50 that it costs to get a state driver's license, for example, on average, which, by the way, in many states is 3 to 5 hours of work at minimum wage. So not insignificant. In addition to the cost of the document itself, we need to think about the cost of transportation. We've been really fortunate in previous years to have partnerships with both Uber and Lyft, where we were able to provide free rideshare transportation to and from ID issuing offices. But on average, that is about $50 to $75, especially in a state like Texas, which has a significant rural population. There's also the cost of time and the cost of logistics. For lots of people, navigating government bureaucracies and systems is challenging, and needing to take time off of work, find care for your children or family members for whom you're a caretaker. It's a barrier, and even in states where there is a free ID to vote, which you'll hear sort of offered as a clapback, if you will, when people say, well, it's easy to get an ID. Even when the state ID is free for voting, the cost of getting there is not. The cost of an underlying document, like a birth certificate that you might need to get that, is not free. And just in general, we need to design voting systems and processes that are easy to navigate, that are not difficult. We need to think about convenience, because convenience really matters when we're thinking about the voting experience. I was reading something this morning that was almost celebrating the fact that 65% of eligible Americans turned out to vote in the last presidential election. By global comparative standards, in a country with centuries of democratic tradition, that is a shameful number. I was also reading that in the San Antonio mayoral election, which took place just this past weekend in Texas, 10% of eligible voters turned out. Just sit on that for a second and think about, what are we doing when we're prioritizing making it harder to vote over making it easier to vote, when 10% of eligible voters in Texas's second biggest city turned out for a really important mayoral election this weekend. Voter ID laws and proof of citizenship laws are really glaring examples of ways in which we are erecting unnecessary barriers in front of eligible voters that are going to depress turnout in a moment in which we need to do everything we can to make those turnout numbers get more, get higher, and build an electorate that is more representative of all Americans, not just the sliver of Americans who have lots of time and money and plan weeks in advance about how they're going to cast a ballot.
So, Jessica, we think of, or at least I think of, these regulations and laws that are attempting to be passed that create these additional barriers for voting as being something that generally it's Republican run states or Republicans in state legislatures or even on the federal level who are introducing this legislation. But you mentioned the rural population in Texas, and that is not a left-leaning population generally. So are you starting to see anything in the conversations with people outside cities, understanding how this is going to impact them and their ability to participate in our democracy?
Yeah, so it is very interesting. It's a very sort of unique sort of thing that's going on that doesn't, in my mind, make quite too much sense. When you look at some of the communities that are most impacted by bills that are, like in Texas, introduced by predominantly Republican lawmakers and are co-sponsored by predominantly Republican lawmakers, a lot of the communities that they're impacting are, majority Republican communities. So whether that be rural voters or even just sort of, we have like research specifically on about how the Texas bill would affect people across just the political spectrum in general in Texas, not even specific to community, but the research shows that Republicans would be impacted more than Democrats, with more than twice as many Republicans in Texas lacking easy access to those citizenship documents compared to Democrats. In these bills, I don't know the reasoning behind it. I don't think that it benefits them in any way, and it for sure doesn't benefit Texas voters. It's, like you said, making things much more difficult. I guess I wanted to say one thing about what Lauren was saying about the importance of convenience for voting and sort of the necessity of it. Just to give an example, in Harris County in 2020, Harris County is a pretty low turnout voter county, all things considered. It's usually below the Texas average for voter turnout, but Harris County in 2020, for first time in a long time, exceeded the voter turnout of the state's average, which was also pretty low, but still better than usual. When you look at why that was, we had a lot of things like drive-through voting, 24-hour voting because of COVID. We had a lot of options that made voting more convenient for voters. And then when those were redacted or retracted, and then we no longer had them 2024, again, Harris County's polling or voter turnout went down below the Texas average again. It's imperative that voting is convenient for people and that it's free, especially.
If I could just chime in to your question, Lisa, VoteRiders is a nonpartisan organization. We're not here to speculate or assign motive. We probably have folks at the Lincoln Project who'd be great at that. And I encourage you to do that. However, I will say, if we look at the sheer numbers, if we look at our research, which shows that nearly 1 in 10 eligible Americans doesn't have easy access to proof of citizenship. It is literally impossible to pass a policy that challenges 10% of eligible American voters and have that impact be limited to any specific geographic or demographic or political affiliation slice of the electorate. That is going to impact everyone. That is going to impact, at the end of the day, our shared democracy and make it harder and harder for eligible Americans of all party affiliations, of no party affiliation, to cast a ballot. And at the end of the day, if we have fewer people participating in elections, if we have an electorate that is a less representative of all of us instead of more, that is going to hurt all of us at the end of the day in terms of the quality of our representative governance. So I would really challenge lawmakers across the political spectrum to think long and hard about what they're proposing and what impact this is going to have. At VoteRiders, we're happy to share our research and have a conversation about the very real barriers that proof of citizenship and stricter ID laws place in front of eligible voters. And I would also just offer, the sort of problem that is getting a lot of unwarranted oxygen in certain segments of the media and political circles that voter ID laws try to solve for is in-person fraud at the ballot box and the additional myth of non-citizens voting in elections. These are made up problems that we are designing legislative solutions, and I use big air quotes around that, to solve for. These problems don't exist. So we are making up a problem and creating very real barriers to the ballot box to solve for it. And that's unacceptable, which is why we're really proud to be standing alongside a huge coalition of partners and advocates and everyday Americans to try and stop these bills before they get too far.
The logic of the argument that non-citizens are attempting to vote in any elections, but in federal elections in particular, is so flawed if you even take a minute to think about it, because why would that be a risk that massive numbers of non-citizens would be willing to take, that they want to break a federal law that has very serious consequences to it? It defies logic that this is going on at any scale. And the research shows, and all of the audits show, that this is a made up problem and we're solving for something that doesn't exist because potentially it advantages one party over another. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the chilling effect on volunteers that these different pieces of legislation have. That part of what a lot of this stuff is targeting is making it illegal to conduct voter registration drives or help get people to the polls or do the kind of work that you all are doing with helping people be able to register and get their documentation. So Jessica, what are you seeing on the ground volunteer side and people being willing to staff the phones and do this work? Is that fear starting to trickle through that they might be crossing lines?
Yeah, so in Texas, the SB 16 legislation, the way that Texas's sort of election system works and our registration laws work are such that we have people that are called volunteer deputy voter registrars. So there are people like me that every 2 years, they take an hour-long class and learn how to register people to vote, collect those forms from people, and then turn them into now our tax collector assessor's office, like here in Harris County, or maybe their elections office. And then they register them to vote and complete the process. It makes things more difficult for those volunteer deputy registrars in the process of registering people to vote and helping people register to vote, because the bill doesn't say that volunteer deputy registrars are qualified to look at and check the accuracy and credibility of somebody's citizenship documentation that they may be showing them. It just says that I'm able to register them to vote on a piece of paper, and then I have to tell them that they need to go and take this information to their local elections office, and they need to bring their citizenship documentation with them within a certain period of time of registering, right? So it puts an undue sort of burden on already just sort of volunteers here in Texas that are helping people register to vote. But I would say the group of people that are probably going to be most impacted by the bill that are at least in Texas, are the election workers who are already very overworked here. The bill is going to require that counties quickly implement sort of a system to accept and process proof of citizenship documents and send out additional notices to voters who do not comply with this law currently. So elections offices across Texas, from rural to urban counties, already struggle to comply with changing election laws on a regular basis. That means recruiting and maintaining staff and getting funding for their essential operations, whatever it may be. This bill adds another burden to election workers that are already, dealing with overflowing plates.
So Lauren, what can the people who are watching this morning do to help? But VoteRiders work is, and also just in general, what would you like? What's the information you would like people to be getting out there and the actions that they can be taking?
Yes. So we can use all the help we can get in this really crucial and timely fight against the wave of voter suppression laws that are showing up across the country. VoteRiders is always looking for volunteers. You can go to our website at voteriders.org/volunteer. Whether you have an hour per week or an hour per month or 5 hours per day, we guarantee we can put you to a good use. We use volunteers as a huge part of our work in reaching out to eligible voters to make sure they know what ID laws are, where they live, and offering free ID help if they need it. So this includes text banking, letter writing, making phone calls. We also train folks to be volunteers on our voter ID helpline and chatbot and respond to thousands of incoming questions we get from confused voters across the country every single month. We also train folks, depending on where they live or even virtually, on how to provide the free direct one-on-one ID assistance to eligible voters that Jessica spoke about. So for folks who live in states with strict ID laws where we have a field presence, sometimes that includes staffing weekly voter ID clinics where we go on site to a high school or a shelter or a job readiness center to meet voters where they are and help them get ID assistance. We are a nonprofit organization. We rely on the tax deductible contributions of people, everyday Americans from all across the country at all different levels. You can go to our site at voteriders.org/donate and make a really important contribution to power our work. A $50 contribution will get a birth certificate for an eligible voter who in Texas may very well need that in order to register and vote in every election going forward. And last but not least, we encourage every single person to be an educated and empowered voter themselves. If you go to our website, voteriders.org/check, you can make sure you're up to speed on the voter ID laws where you live. You can call or text our helpline at 866-ID to vote if you have any questions or need free help, and help us spread the word. You know, I said this earlier, but in this sea of changing laws and confusing bills moving, the more we can do to educate ourselves and our communities and everyone we are around, the better. So spread the word, share our website with folks, follow us on social media, and amplify our accurate, nonpartisan content. And let's do everything we can. I'm a really big believer in everyone, no matter how small your footprint or following may be, has the unique power to change a few people and get them to vote. And I think that is more important now than ever before.
Right. We don't need one person to come in and be the hero. We need a million heroes across the country doing small things in your community, in your circle of influence. And that's what creates real change. So thank you so much, Lauren and Jessica, for being here this morning. This is a really important conversation, and we so appreciate the work that you're both doing. It can be thankless, but you have our thanks deeply. It doesn't get more important than making sure that people can participate in their democracy. So keep it up and come back and talk to us again soon, I hope.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us to do this work, and thank you for showcasing it.
Thank you.